Hi everyone, welcome to your homeroom content for today. Today we are going to be doing an election preview. If you didn't know, 6 days from now we have the big election for the year. We've been talking about it all year. You've been seeing things on the news. You've probably been getting advertisements. You've seen political ads on your YouTube, viewage, all sorts of things. So I'm your host here, Mr. Bale, one of the government teachers here at Lynbrook, and I'm going to walk you through some of these big things.
And we're going to South Dakota and Oregon and Washington and Michigan. And then we're going to Washington, D.C. to take back the White House. Yeah!
The first thing we need to understand a little bit is democracy itself. So how does America actually fare? We tend to think of ourselves as one of the world's greatest democracies.
And a nation is born. Now let us party like 'twas 1799.
Please, sir, you're destroying my establishment.
We just created the greatest democracy on earth, you low-life commoner! Get out!
But do we actually participate? That's one of the big questions that political scientists always want to know. So let's take a look at the data. How does America actually stack up against other countries, especially countries similar to ours? Does our citizenry actually match up? Let's take a look at this type of graphic, shall we?
Let's assume that each one of these circles represents 10% of voter turnout. So the ideal democracy will have 100% turnout, but that's really unlikely. The countries that are seen as the best in voter turnout are countries like Sweden, Denmark, Iceland, and Norway, which generally get more than about 85% of voter age population. One tier down would be a country like the Netherlands, which typically enjoys about a 75% voting rate. Typically right below them would be Japan, about 70%, and also Russia, the same, but recently Japan's numbers have been way down. That takes us to India, which typically has a voter turnout of 65%. And now as we get to 55%, we get countries like South Africa and, of course, the United States of America. However, not all elections in the United States happen to be that high. If you're talking about congressional elections, they're sadly only about 40%.
This is unacceptable.
And then there's North Korea, which supposedly has 100%.
So election 2020, what are the citizens actually voting on this particular year? Well, like in many years in California, we have a proposition system, meaning the people vote on various things put forward by fellow citizens. They sometimes have referendums on things that have already been passed by the state assembly and state senate, and other types of changes. So we have a host of things. We also have a ton of candidates. Now, who those candidates are depends on, of course, where you live.
Hey, Four Eyes, vote Quimby. Hey, Beardo, vote Quimby. This time he's the lesser of two evils.
Yeah, I love Grimby.
So let's take a look at what is actually on the ballot this year and who is running for office.
So what is on the ballot? Here in California, it can sometimes seem exhausting because there's so many things to research and put energies in amongst all the normal things we always do. This is why some people get discouraged and don't necessarily want to vote.
Now here's a party I can get excited about. Sign me up.
Sorry, not with that attitude.
Okay, then screw it.
Welcome aboard, brother.
All right.
You're out.
But it is your civic duty, so let's take a look. There's Prop 14, which would authorize bonds continuing stem cell research. There's Prop 15, which increased funding sources for public schools, community colleges, and local government by changing tax assessments of various properties. There's Prop 16, which would allow diversity as a factor in public employment, education, and contractual decisions. There's Prop 17, which would restore the right to vote after completion of a prison term. There's Prop 18, which would amend the Constitution to let 17-year-olds vote in certain elections. There's Prop 19, which changes certain property tax rules. There's Prop 20, which restricts parole for certain offenses currently considered to be nonviolent and other type of things. There's Prop 21, which would expand the local government's authority to enact rent control. There's Prop 22, which exempts app-based transportation and delivery companies from providing employee benefits to certain drivers. There's Prop 23, which would establish state requirements for kidney dialysis clinics. There's Prop 24, which amends consumer privacy laws. And there's Prop 25, a referendum on law that would be replacing money bail with a system based on public safety and flight risk. So let's review. California voters are voting on tax policy, consumer privacy, kidney dialysis, Uber drivers, price ceilings, parole, youth voting, systemic racist issues. We have ex-felon rights, college funding, stem cells, and the bail bond industry. So who are the candidates for the 17th district here in California? Well, we have the Democratic incumbent, Ro Khanna, and we have his Republican challenger, Ritesh Tandon. So let's zoom in here and take a look at the district that Lynbrook is in, and that's the California 17th. Now, these things do change from time to time as new census data rearranges the boundaries. And as a result, take a look at this. Here is Lynbrook High School right here. So you can see that we are barely as a school, barely in the 17th. And in fact, some residents appear to be in the 18th congressional district, for instance, if you happen to live on Oak Knoll Drive. I'd have to double check that, but at least according to this, there's a decent likelihood that who you choose to elect in the 17th district in this election may in fact not be a representative when we go through a redistricting process shortly after the census information is actually tabulated. We're also, of course, voting for the presidency. Who's running? Well, in California, because the things are, of course, different in every state, we have 6 candidates on the ballot for the presidency. You can take a look, for instance, at the 2016 presidential popular vote summary, and these were all candidates that were listed on at least one state ballot. As you can see, you probably don't recognize a whole lot of these people or a whole lot of those parties. Okay, but what you can see here is the top 5 candidates that you may have heard of took over 99% of the vote. So there's always the option of voting third party.
It's a two-party system. You have to vote for one of us.
He's right. This is a two-party system.
Well, I believe I'll vote for a third-party candidate.
Go ahead. Throw your vote away.
But of course, the likelihood that your vote is going to matter significantly is slim, so many people take that in consideration when they're choosing how to vote.
That was pretty cool. I think I'm actually starting to get interested in politics.
At the end of today's video, we're actually going to give you guys the opportunity to do a mock vote.
I don't care how educational it is. Let's do it.
So how have Lindbergh students actually voted in the past? Well, we're going to take a trip out to the quad right now and take a look at some of the results from previous mock vote elections.
All right, here we are where the steps used to be at the top of the quad back in 2016 when I ran the last presidential mock election. Who were the candidates then? For what offices, and how did Lindbergh students vote?
For the race for Congress, for the 17th district, Mike Honda was the incumbent Democrat who had been serving for 16 years, and he was being challenged by another Democrat, Ro Khanna, and the results for this election was 51 to 49%. Lindbergh students chose Ro Khanna, who of course was the eventual winner of the race. When it came to United States Senator, we had 2 Democrats running, and Lindbergh students chose overwhelmingly by a 2-to-1 ratio Kamala Harris, who was the Attorney General of California at the time, over U.S. Congresswoman Loretta Sanchez. And of course, Kamala Harris ended up winning that seat. So once again, the Lindbergh students mirrored the actual election. And when it came to the President of the United States, you can see that Hillary Clinton and her running mate Tim Kaine were the big winners here at Lindbergh High School, taking home 3 out of every 4 votes, so 75%. Second place was eventual, obviously, winner in real life, Donald Trump and his running mate Michael Pence. They took home 15%. And then we saw small margins for some of the third-party candidates. Gary Johnson took 3%, Jill Stein took 3%, and Gloria La Riva took 4%.
All right, we're out here in the quad right in front of the cafeteria. And in the fall of 2019, we ran a straw poll for the presidency right here at Lindbergh. And over the course of a week, students could come every day if they wanted to and get 5 different votes. And those votes would be put in the form of little beans in all sorts of different containers that represented the more than 20 candidates that were interested in running for the presidency in 2020. People could come one day, they could come every day, but this is why it is a straw poll. It's non-scientific and it's certainly not binding, but it shows who people are interested and where the intensity is. So you could, of course, put 5 votes in one person's jar, or you could spread them out. So let's take a look at how Lindbergh felt about the candidates way back about a year ago in the fall of 2019.
There were a lot of candidates to choose from. In the primaries, a lot of people throw their hat out there, see if anything is sticking from their message, and then try to decide whether to go on from there. There was dozens of candidates at this point. Okay, there were several Republican challengers to Trump and a ton of Democrats that wanted to take on Trump in the 2020 election. And so these are pictures of some of those candidates. So how did these candidates actually do in the race? Well, most of them didn't really get a lot of votes. These were the only candidates here that got at least 100 votes in our straw poll. So let's take a look at who these people actually are. We have Bernie Sanders, Kamala Harris, Pete Buttigieg, Donald Trump, Andrew Yang, Joe Biden, and Elizabeth Warren. So how did they end up finishing? Well, the overall dominant winner here at Lindbergh was Andrew Yang. Took home 452 votes over the week's voting. Donald Trump, The only Republican to get more than 100 votes came in second with 250. Very closely behind him was Elizabeth Warren with 241, followed by Bernie Sanders with 197, Joe Biden with 115, Pete Buttigieg with 107, and then Kamala Harris with 103. So the straw poll showed extreme interest in Andrew Yang as a presidential candidate here at Lindbergh. Although Andrew Yang didn't last very long in the Democratic primaries, this is, of course, a show, at least here in the Bay Area, at least amongst young people. People were very interested in the candidacy of Andrew Yang and some of his ideas and, of course, what he represented.
Okay, so now it's time for the mock vote.
We don't have everything on the ballot because a number of things on the ballot would be, of course, highly differentiated based on where you live. Remember, we have students at Lindbergh High School that live in San Jose, Saratoga, Cupertino, Sunnyvale, and maybe even some other cities. So if you actually break it down, there's so many variables. So we're just going to do the president, vice president, our congressional representative for the California 17th, and then 3 propositions from the California ballot in 2020. We'll start with the presidency. Here's our presidential candidates. First, we have Rocky de la Fuente Guerra. He's a 66-year-old San Diego-based businessman. He owns auto dealerships. He's had currency exchange locations in his portfolio and also banks over the years. This guy, since 2016, has run a lot. He's run for president. He's run for Senate seats in 9 different states. 8 of those were in the exact same year, taking advantage of very lax rules on the residency for Senate. And he also ran for mayor of New York City, despite not living in New York City. What's very fascinating is you might know that is Mr. Kanye West is his running mate.
No! No! No!
Parties can nominate whoever they want for a vice presidential candidate. And so what you see here is that Kanye West, who was running for president, not sure why, in a bunch of other states, is running as a vice president, despite not even knowing it, here in California. What a system. Next we have Howie Hawkins. He's a 67-year-old trade unionist and environmental activist. He's now retired. He previously worked for the Teamsters and as a construction worker after serving in the Marines for some years. He has run for office in New York 12 times in a variety of positions and has never won. Next, we have Jo Jorgensen, who is residing in South Carolina. She is a full-time professor at Clemson University teaching psychology. She has previously run for a congressional seat and was previously a vice presidential candidate, also has not been elected. Joe Biden, of course, one of our 2 primary candidates, age 77, currently residing in Delaware. He, of course, is a former vice president of the United States, serving under Barack Obama from the years 2009 to 2017. Before that, he was U.S. Senator from 1973 until he took the vice presidency. He previously had presidential runs in 1988 and 2008 as a Democrat. Our incumbent president is Donald Trump, age 74, currently residing as official location is in Florida. He is, of course, the sitting United States president since 2017. In his past life / current life, he's a real estate developer and at one point casino owner. He was previously associated with the Reform and Democratic parties and also as an independent for some time before becoming a Republican. And finally on the ballot here in California, we have Gloria La Riva, age 66, from New Mexico. She's a social activist and she's running on the Peace and Freedom ticket, but is most closely associated with the Party for Socialism and Liberation. What's interesting about her is that this is the 10th consecutive presidential election that she has been on the ballot. 10th consecutive. Okay, so she's basically a perennial candidate. Now, for the House of Representatives, we saw our options before. It's Mr. Khanna or Mr. Tandon, and so we can get a little bit more information about them. Here are some of the priorities that Ro Khanna has basically talked about on his election website. He has been currently serving in Congress for the last 4 years. For Mr. Tandon here, he is a tech senior director and businessman. Some of his priorities that he has listed out on his website include things like less regulation of business and lower taxes on corporations, and also expediting the citizenship process and using the merit system for immigration. So those are our 2 candidates for the 17th. Now let's get to our 3 propositions. The first is Proposition 16, which I can tell from driving around the Lindbergh neighborhood has obviously gotten some traction because I can see a lot of signs for or against it in people's yards. Not all the propositions actually gain that much what we might call citizen attention, but some do. So what would this do? Proposition 16 would allow state and local governments, public universities, and other political subdivisions the ability to use what we call affirmative action policies when involving sex-based or race-based criteria. The background on this goes back to 1996. In 1996, California voters passed Proposition 209, and Proposition 209 disallowed usage of affirmative action policies for preferential considerations, and also had stipulations for anti-discrimination. So Proposition 16 would cancel Proposition 209's banning of affirmative action sections of that particular legislature. The bill's authors cited the need to acknowledge the deep-seated inequality and far-reaching institutional failures that show that your race and gender still matter. Why Proposition 16 is maybe of interest to people outside of California is that back when Proposition 209 passed, it was one of the first states to actually enact sort of an anti-affirmative action policy. Several states then followed California's lead in also doing that thing. Some people look now, especially in the era of Black Lives Matter and this idea of looking at systemic racism in our society and the idea that merit system is not necessarily actually still merit-based. Some people believe that Proposition 16 could be very similar to Prop 209 in terms of setting a standard for other states. So we will see whether that actually happens or not. Proposition 18 is a second proposition. This is a very straightforward one. This would amend the California Constitution to permit 17-year-olds to vote in the primary and special elections if they actually turn 18 by the next general election and will be otherwise eligible to vote. The idea here is you get a better sense of how people will vote in the general election if you let them vote in the primaries. And there's also some anecdotal data that says the earlier you let people vote, the more likely they will become established voters. Not a whole lot of evidence out there, but you can see on this particular proposition, there's very little organization against it. No money's been being raised against it. And it's not as controversial, but that doesn't necessarily mean it'll pass. So what do you think? To give you some background here, these are the states that actually allow 17-year-olds to vote already. Finally, we have Proposition 25. This is a referendum. And what a referendum means is the citizens saying yay or nay to a bill that has already passed the California legislature. So the background here is that this is about cash bail and whether to get rid of cash bail. If you don't know what the bail bond system is, basically it's like this. If you get charged for a crime and you're incarcerated, in order to be released before your trial, you put down a collateral, and that collateral is money that you would forfeit if you didn't show up for trial. Because the collateral is relatively high, bail bond companies generally pay it for you for a cost. That cost in California is 10% of whatever your bail has been set for. So if you have a $5,000 bail, you would be paying $500. Okay, that would be your charge. But the bail bond company would post the $5,000 and they get that money back when you actually show up to trial. Criticisms of the bail system include things like takes advantage of the poor who may not actually be able to afford the bail and thus need to languish in prison and wait around for their actual trial, even if they aren't actually, of course, guilty. So we're weighing in on a bill that has already been passed, and that's what we call a referendum. So you can see a lot of money has been raised for this. We see $14 million to pass, $10 million to defeat. So there's a lot at stake with Proposition 25. So what do you think? Should we keep cash bail or should we have a risk-based assessment?
We're going to have your teacher actually explain how to get to the mock vote that you can vote on today. So make sure to do that and participate, and we're going to report back to you next week on what the results were from this mock election.
Election day is on its way. It's such a grand occasion. Time to make decisions for the future of our nation. Candidates are on the stump. Podiums are pounded. In the end, the choice is yours, so stand up and be counted. Exercise your right to kick politician booty. Now's the time to vote and do your patriotic duty. Go vote!
All right, friends, thanks for tuning in today. Hopefully you've learned a little something and gotten a little bit jazzed about what's going to happen in 6 days.
Sir, do you know how fast you were going?
Yeah, 86 miles per hour. Now, would you mind writing this up fast? I've got to get home before the polls close. I've got to vote.
You haven't voted?
A Nambe ice bucket. Cap Snappler.
Remember, on November 3rd, everyone goes to the polls. Many people have already voted due to absentee ballots or mail-in balloting. We may actually not know who the President of the United States is or how some of these propositions actually went for several days to come because there's a lot of votes to be counted. But by the end of next week, maybe. We hope to know who our next President of the United States will be. And all those other offices and all those other things. So until next time, so long and happy elections.